All right, so when we're planning out our garden, which is something depending on the time of year and how big your garden is, I try to have my plan done by Groundhog Day just because it's a 2 acre plan. So I don't have I can't be thinking about making decisions in the middle of May. So if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. Um, if you want to be a successful gardener, my recommendation is to stay busy gardening as much as possible, particularly throughout the year. Most people will get real busy between May and September in their gardens, and they don't really think about what could be grown in the wintertime. But here in our climate, it's not that hard to grow a garden year round. And depending on how cold it gets in January, there are some things that are pretty happy, and there are some pretty easy methods to provide some season extension by some ground covers and little mini hoop houses and things like that you can grow a lot of stuff year round. That, of course, also maximizes the potential of the space. Making a plan maximizes the potential of the space versus just going out and saying, okay, the second weekend of May, I'm going to go buy my transplants and plug them in the ground, which is another method, but it's not the planned method. All right, so if you want to make a plan, then you start with making a list of things you want to grow, and then you kind of organize the list. And one would be you organize it by crop, and then within each crop, you organize it by variety. So in our example, we have our tomato crop organized by varieties of Cherokee Purple and Vincent Watts, and our beets are organized with Detroit Red and Touchstone Gold. And so that way you can put all of your crops in the same kind of spaces, because more than likely they're all going to take similar management, even though Vincent Watts grows a little taller than the Cherokee Purple, but between, they're still tomatoes and they're still both going to be kind of big and bulky come the 1st of August, and you're going to have a plan to deal with those, versus if you had your tomatoes in between your beets, then your beets are going to get overrun. All right. And then you're going to organize, once the list is organized by crop and variety, then you'll, depending on what season you're doing, at this point we might only be thinking about warm season stuff, but then you can kind of organize it into warm versus cold, summer versus spring. That spring might also be your fall list. That spring and fall list, there's a lot of overlap there. And some of that spring and fall stuff can get stretched into the winter with just a little bit of help. And then once you have the list organized into warm and cold, then you got to find a resource. And in this case, I would recommend the Clyde's Garden Planner. And it's a little slide rule type thing. We can go over that during lunch. They're super cool. And it helps you determine when to plant things based on your last frost date. Or your first frost date, depending if you're doing it in the fall. And then, of course, once you know when you need to be fiddling with your seed in terms of growing your transplants or putting them in the ground, then, of course, you got to get your seed ordered or go to the hardware store and buy it. If you order seed, you'll have availability of a lot more diversity versus this stuff you can find at the hardware store. These are two companies that or here at the library. Yeah, we have a nice collection of seed here at the library. But these are some companies that I've worked with in the past. Southern Exposure, they're in Virginia. So True is over in Asheville. And they're both focused on heirloom seeds. And then Rare Seeds is in Missouri. And they have a beautiful catalog, if for no other reason, to order their catalog just to look at it, because it's beautiful photography, neat stories about the different varieties, but that's definitely a catalog worth getting. So that's some easy ways to get that information. All right, and then here's some other resources. And these are things that if you Google, University of Tennessee extension, and then the name of the publication, whether it's PB 901, SP 291-P, or the other one. It takes you to a PDF, and these are pretty informative. Now, there are other UT publications available, but these are the ones that I really recommend, just because the Growing Vegetables in Home Gardens has some general information, but the other ones kind of have some good like timeliness information to say that, okay, if you want to do your fall garden, these are the times that you'll want to if you live in this particular part of the state. So they're good resources for that reason. Alrighty, and then so as far as the timing goes, there's those resources, and then the Clyde's Garden Planner that we'll get a copy of later. The important thing for us to know here is when our frost dates are. So generally speaking, April 20 is our last frost. Sometimes one will sneak in on May 1st, and then their first frost is around November the 15th. The first and last frost dates are given with 50% confidence, meaning that half of years that's true, but the other half of years it may be earlier or maybe later. I'm kind of feeling like we've already had our last frost and we're not even at April 20 this year, but looking at the 2-week forecast, it's going to get a little chilly a couple nights from now, and then it's back up into the 50s each night until the end of the month. So I think this year we're a little early. And it'll be the same in the fall. So when we're starting our seeds, we have to think about our crop yields, particularly. That's a big question when people are planting their gardens. How much of any one thing do I need to plant if I want to grow food for 4 to 6 people or whatever? Because it seems like most people would prefer to only grow as much as they need, but they don't know how much that is, so they grow 3 times as much. And then they have an issue, one, with maintaining all that space, and number 2 is what are you going to do with all that stuff? So it's easy to go to church and give stuff away, but it's 3 times more work between now and then. So if you're dealing with seed, this rule of thumb of expecting losses at 10% of each stage will ensure that you have as much of that crop as you want at harvest. And it may mean that you get to give some transplants away. But basically, when you plant your seeds, only 9 out of 10 of them are going to come up, and that's pretty good. Maybe 10 out of 10 of them will come up, and that's even better. But if you plan on 9, and then only 6 come up, then maybe we have to plant some more. But then when you pot them up from germination to the next pot up, you might lose a couple. You might lose a couple when you transplant them out in the field, and then the rabbits might come and get a couple more while they're growing. So these are all just ways of making sure that when it's time to go out there and harvest, that you actually have as much as you were hoping that you'd have. So that's one thing, is to expect some losses along the way. But then the other part is knowing how much of one thing do I need to grow to get as much as I want. So those summer fruiting crops listed first are things like tomatoes, squash, cucumbers, things you go out and you pick the fruit from. You might, I'm going to say those 3. You'll be pretty happy if you have 2 to 4 plants for each one of those. 3 to 8 plants per person for other things, and that would be things like beans, okra, or that's beans and okra for the most part. And then more for root crops, for radishes, for carrots, for beets, for turnips. And that's really just for the fresh eating part of the season. If you want to can stuff, plant more for canning. And you basically want to plant as much for at least one more person for everybody that's going to eat the canned stuff. So if you're growing your garden for 4 people and you want to can for 4 people, that means you need to double those first numbers at least. And that's really if you're just going to be eating those things a couple times a week. If you're like, no, we're going to live off of our garden, then you're going to grow a big garden. And then, of course, if you really like something in particular or you want to share it, then you can plant some more beyond that. But as you can see, if you just want some fresh eating garden, that's not a lot of stuff at all. You can pretty easily manage that in a fairly compact space, so it's fairly easy to do. All right, and then as far as planning out that space, actually drawing a plan is a good way to go. And you can get print-free graph paper at the printfreegraphpaper.com website, and it will ask you how big you want your little grids to be. And you can, you just enter in those parameters, and it prints out the paper. It's a little bit easier, in my opinion, to have your cold season stuff in a separate space from your warm season stuff, because your spring space will also then become your fall space, and then your warm season stuff will just be running through the warmth of the main season. And then you'll want to make note of which way south, so that you don't plant your things that are going to get really tall. They're going to get really tall. They need to be on the north side, so they're not blocking the sun of the things that are going to be shorter when they're growing at the same time. All right, as far as spacing goes, you can consult your seed packet. You can consult the Clyde's Garden Planner chart for the row spacing. That information's on there too. Another thing to consider is the size of the tools you're using. So if you have a little rototiller and it's your intention to run the rototiller in your aisles to keep the weeds out of your aisles, then make sure that your aisles are 6 inches wider than your rototiller, so you can run it up and down easy, and you're not going to knock anything over. If you're going to plant a double row of beets and your hoe is 5 inches wide, put your beet rows 6 or 8 inches apart, and you can easily hoe between your beets. And that's the other thing, is to consider a double or triple row system instead of a single row system. And that kind of goes back to all of your different tools. And if you have a rototiller that has an 18-inch tiller box on it, you can make a nice seed bed running back and forth, and you can treat that as a bed and then put 2 rows of something in it if they're small. So 2 rows of beets, 3 rows of carrots, 3 rows of radishes, and then you have your 18-inch aisle that you run up and down. So that's another way to kind of compact your management space, and it makes managing it easier. All right, and so here's a sample plan, and this is just for a very small 4 by 12 foot box, and you can kind of see my my legend there, what all those random shapes mean, and we got the tall things on the south side, and then some short things on the north side. I have the pole beans. I had the pole beans and the trellis cucumbers on the south of the lettuces, so that those tall things are actually providing the lettuce's shade, because lettuce doesn't like to grow here in the heat of the sun in the summertime. So that's a strategy to actually create shade for those things. And then I got some tomatoes in cages in the corners, and some peppers and squash plants out in the front. Peppers in particular want all the sun they can get, and squash plants, they certainly won't mind it either. Alrighty. And this is another sample plan in a bigger space. So this is a 1,000 square foot garden, 20 by 50. And the first bed there started out as beets, but then it moved to okra, because around the time that your beets finish, assuming you planted them around now or a little earlier than now, then right around the time those beets finish, you still have time to put okra in. Same way with the next row that has spinach and bush beans. And then the onions, you got to plant them real early, but they don't come out of the ground until the middle of June, and so you can hold that space until the fall. And then that tomato space is extra big because the tomatoes need lots of airflow. I didn't plan that necessarily so the tomatoes could take up that space It was so that they had plenty of airflow to lessen the likelihood of our humid air diseases that we get here in the South. And then the next row is pole beans and cucumbers. That's an extra big row for the cucumbers because they're going to sprawl out in the little tiny garden. I put the tomatoes or cucumbers on a trellis to make it really compact. But in this more bigger space, you could let those sprawl on the ground unless they're a really long cucumber. If they're longer than 8-inch cucumbers, you're going to want to trellis them anyway because they curl. Unless you like curly cucumbers. And the next one's squash, and then eggplants and peppers there. And that's the south side because they like lots of heat. Alrighty. That might be. So that's it for planning.